Ahmed organised the Brick Lane Circle every year and organises these great talks. We've got 4 people who have all got different views on history and its role in identity formation. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting, but I think we should kick off with 2 things. One is asking everybody very quietly just to move 1 row forward, I think, and the other is to listen to Ahmed talk about the rest of the Bengal History Week. So that's what just everybody move 1 step forward, please.
Thank you very much for coming to this panel discussion tonight. My name is Ahmed. I'm the Secretary of Brick Lane Circle. I'll just tell a little bit about Brick Lane Circle and then about the Bengal History Week, and then pass on to the chair for tonight's session. In the Brick Lane Circle, we started informally in the mid-1990s from our Brick Lane cafes talking about politics, Bangladesh politics. But then, reading newspapers and having big heated debates, we realized we were not really developing our understanding of Bangladesh and Bangladesh politics. So we thought, why don't we get together and have formal sessions, invite scholars, and even us to research for a month, then come and share with colleagues. So we did that for a few years, right? And then we got bored, right? It was informal. But 2007, because we were missing it, and 2007 we restarted in a formal way with like a series of seminars on a whole range of issues. And also in 2007 was the 250th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey, when the British took over Bengal. So we decided to do something to remember, to understand. So we had some events, including a conference on East India Company and the Battle of Plassey and so on. Try to develop a better understanding of the links between Bengal and the UK. And out of the conference and other activities, a project idea emerged, and we applied to Heritage Lottery and we got some funding. It was called the Battle of Plassey Young People's Project, which involved actually recruiting some young people to voluntarily engage, do research on different aspects of East India Company and write a chapter each. Right? So it took more than, we initially thought it was going to take 1 year, but it actually took 2 years. And the young people did produce, so 8 young people wrote a chapter each, and we got a book called Plassey's Legacy. And you can get more information on our website. It's called the-eastindiacompany.org. Anyway, and when the project was finishing, one of the authors of the book, she suggested, because they learned so much about history and they learned so much about where to get information in the British Library, books and other sources of information. So she suggested, why not have an annual Bengal History Week where we can continue the process of learning. So 2010, we started the Bengal History Week. Basically, what we do, we, in the Bangladeshi community and other communities as well, people have knowledge about history. Usually it's ideological, political, and then you have different groups have their own different histories, and then they sort of develop strong positions, right? And one group doesn't talk to another. So we have polarization. So what we are trying to do, we're trying to create an environment where people learn history and then they share with others, but use evidence, and the logical, how do you say this? Rules of logic, right? To develop, an understanding or explanation and imagination to try and give depth and so on. And we try to create an environment where all types of people can come and don't feel like they're being brainwashed or they have to support this politics or that politics. So this is what we are about. And today, now I think I will just pass on to Fuad now. I've said enough. Thank you.
Thank you. These talks wouldn't really happen without this organisation. I think most of you already know that, but just in case, do keep supporting Brick Lane Circle. I'm going to just follow the names in the order that they're printed, but I'll read out the title which has persuaded you all to come. Are we Bengalis, Bangladeshis, Muslims, British or something else? All of the above or none of the above? Londoners, whatever. I think I've been all or none of those things, or a mixture of all those things at some time or another. So I don't really have a firm opinion on this, one way or the other. It's a topic that I think we could all talk about all night, or we could just sit down and just and live an identity. But I think the common thread between all the speakers today is that they've all participated in Brick Lane Circle talks before, usually on aspects of history, and I think they'll bring that to the talk. So we've asked them just to talk for about 5 minutes or so, as long as they like. But I think just to give a bit of a theme to a bit of structure, could you sort of say a bit about what you think your identity is and how important it is to you, and why you think people should be interested, if you can cover that in your 5 minutes or so. But otherwise, I'll let you give your own introduction. So we'll go in the order that were printed. So Dr. Nazneen Ahmed is going to be first, which is kick off.
Yes, and I just want to really reiterate how important Bengal history is, first of all, because I was doing, as part of my research, I was doing a walking tour of Brick Lane with 10 Muslim young people and 10 Jewish young people, looking at the shared histories of the area with them just 2 or 3 weeks ago. And I had a couple of girls from this area, from Forest Gate, and I was really kind of thinking that, I said to them, well, I'm going to be telling you stuff that you already know, you're going to be really bored. And when, we went and had a look at the Shahid Minar, I asked them, do you know what this is? They didn't know. Walked down, talked about the race riots, asked them if they knew about the history of racism that their parents or their aunts and uncles had faced in the 70s and 80s. They didn't know. And it was quite a shock to me that actually, without Bengal history, without events like this, and the project, the Plasi project, there's actually, the British history curriculum doesn't have a space at the moment for Bengali history and the history of Bangladeshis in Britain. So I think I'm really glad to be part of it. I would say I would call myself a British Bangladeshi Muslim. So, but I guess when I was thinking about the project, the seminar title, I was quite amused by the something else and the ors as well, because I don't know, we're kind of at a stage now, I think, where we all recognise that identity is multiple, that you are part of different networks of affiliation, and that you can be lots of different things at one time. It's usually when you have to take a census report, or you have to fill in your a job application, that you end up getting that box at the bottom where you have to tick British, then South Asian, and then underneath Asian, then you have to tick Bangladeshi. But in reality, as Niaz said, that our identities are much more fluid, they're much more complex, and I suppose it's been reflected in the course of my research, because I started off when I was doing my PhD looking at the history and the development of secular nationalist identity in Bangladesh, or in East Pakistan, from 1947 to 1971, and really looking at how the movement for Bangladesh developed through culture. And some of you know that I've spoken about that before in this area. But since then, I've also been much more focused on Bangladeshis in Britain, and also on Islamic identities as well. So the tension between what has been represented as a tension between secularism and Islam is kind of been formative of my work, but also is something that I'm increasingly trying to complicate. So today I want to really focus, I suppose, on the are we Bangladeshi or Bengali element of the seminar title. And I just want to show how history and historiography can itself complicate that question, and how the idea of a regional identity, a united regional identity that would be Bengaliness, and then a later identity of Bangladeshiness, and how those have different kind of meanings, have developed different meanings, can also be complicated if we go back and we actually use the methods of historiography to actually think it through. So I basically don't want to answer the question. I just want to raise a few examples of how it's a very complicated area, and it's something we need to continually rethink. And so I want to draw attention to one really amazing academic article which kind of completely changed the way I thought about the idea of the development of secular Bangladeshi identity. And it's a historian in the US called Sana Ayar who wrote an article about Ruhul and his role in partition. And her article, she shows that Hock was not really, he was very much able to negotiate these different identities that we as Bengalis, as Bangladeshis, continually negotiate. Being Muslim, being part of a landmass called Bengal, and being Bengali speakers, and then later on being part of Bangladesh. And she talks about him as developing a third trajectory which sought to reconcile religious and regional identification within a political discourse that wasn't exclusionary. And so she's trying to say that there was like a different way to have between this idea that there is a secular Bangladeshi identity, which is based on that we are all Bengali. We are all Bengali, this emphasis on linguistic identity that also makes an assumption about ethnic and identity, and then also flattens in that kind of idea of secularism, religious identity. And a lot of critics of secularist Bangladeshi nationalism have said that it is basically anti-Islam, that most of the kind of leaders of the movement were atheists or socialists, and that they really were very hostile to Islam. And actually, I don't think that's necessarily true. I do agree that there was a socialist movement that led the Bangladeshi nationalist movement, but it's more complicated than that. So, and I think Fazlul Haq is used by Sana Ayar as a way of just demonstrating the complexity of Bengali politics and Bengali history, because he really opposed Jinnah and presented himself as an alternative spokesperson and representing Bengali Muslims, and originally also opposing the division of Bengal. It shows how you could actually be Bengali and be a very explicitly fervent and practicing Muslim. So he's a character who's kind of important in trying to break down this polarization that we have here in terms of the secular and the Islamic. So I think it's a really valuable article that shows how you can do a really in-depth historiography and really complicate these assumptions. Another example would be the research that's done by Nazneen and Murshid in Sacred and Secular, and also by Joy Chatterjee, which actually looks at the kind of ways in which voting worked during partition. And it's particularly interesting because there are a series of different referenda that happened in 47. And it shows the real complexity and the ambiguity of the kind of feeling about partition, about the creation of Pakistan, especially in Bengal. Because whilst, and this is quite complicated, but when the Muslim League members of the Bengal Assembly were asked to vote on partition, they voted against by 106 votes to 35. So they didn't want partition. They did overall vote for an independent Muslim homeland, but they didn't want the partition of Bengal. So but they were made to choose, and in the end, their voices were lost out amongst the other claims that were being made, and because it was seen as totally incompatible with what needed to happen, that particular vote was totally disregarded. So that's an interesting statistic. There's an interesting historical fact that actually Bengali Muslims didn't want Bengal to be divided. So at that moment, they were invested in the idea of being Bengali as well as being Muslim. So, and I think finally, I just want to talk about two cultural examples because I'm a cultural historian, and the things I look at are novels and films and plays and poetry mostly. And the first is Selina Hossain's novel Hangar Nadi Grenade, which is the shark, the river, the grenade. And in that she presents a kind of idyllic village that is then kind of destroyed by the 1971 war, and a kind of the village politics, and she presents that through an ordinary woman called Buri. But what's really interesting to me as part of that novel is that whilst it is ostensibly, a novel which is, critical of religious fundamentalism and critical of the Pakistani atrocities that took place, what's actually at the centre of it is a friendship between Buri as a Muslim woman and her friend Nita, who's a Sufi Baal singer. And they have these discussions about Islam, about their faith, but it is very much rooted within the land, and it is seen as different to the kind of Islam that is then sort of imposed upon them and that is brought over with Pakistan, and that changes the actual structure of the society. And that's a similar pattern that is in a film that was recently actually broadcast as part of the Channel 4's Indian film season, which makes us, we could ask us as part of something else, are we actually Indians? Because that's what they chose to put the film on, and Tariq Masood is now subsumed as an Indian. But Tariq Masood, the late, great Tariq Masood's film Mati Moina, The Clay Bird, was actually shown on Channel 4 a few weeks ago. And in Mati Moina, it's a really moving allegory of Pakistan. I'm sure some of you have seen it. But what I'm really interested in is the figure of the boatman in that film, who speaks to the fervent secular nationalist, a young man who wants to go and he's joined the language movement and he's going to fight and defend his village against the Pakistani army. And he's very much a scientist and very much one of these kind of atheistic figures that have kind of come to sort of typify the Bangladeshi nationalist movement. And the boatman just says, what are you talking? He's saying, Islam is it's an ideology. It deludes people. And the boatman just says, what are you on about? Islam has been part of this country, part of this soil for hundreds of years. That kind of Islam that is being practiced by the fanatical father who sends his son to the madrasa, that kind of Islam is not Bengali Islam. That is new Islam. But there is another kind of Islam. So I think I'll just end with that.
Thank you, Nazneen. We'll have questions at the end for all the speakers, but if there's any particular points of clarification, if anyone wants a particular quote or something you want to shout out, and I do stand a chance, but otherwise we'll move off.
I agree with most of what you said. An interesting illustration would be the that you mentioned is the 3 lectures that were held in what is now Bangladesh. One was in 1935, just after the first of the top 1 member, 1 vote, but with a very extended franchise. And in Bengal, that election was not won by Muslim League of Congress, it was won by the Krishna Project Party, which is Fazlul Haq's party. At that time, the people of this area identified themselves as in terms of class. But exactly 10 years later, in 46, when the same elections were held, it was trumped by Muslim League. The Muslim League won the election, and that had the same group of people, effectively, were saying that we are Muslims. And then we had another election in 54, which was just 8 years after that, where the same group of people nearly sort of said we are Bengalis. So there is a tension, and that those three elections clearly reveals that tension, how people politically make use of what, if you look at broad, the way I look at it is, broad historical terms, is uneven development, that there were uneven development after British Union rule came within two communities, and those uneven development had class implications and then politics took over. Because what was interesting in 1947, as George and others have shown, is that the people who fought to keep Bengal united in 1995 are the people who brought up Bengal in 1947. Because one of the issues that the Pakistan movement brought in was how in a democracy where it is one member, one vote, you protect minorities. And the tensions in 1947 were Muslim League in Bengal, were wanting Pakistan but not wanting Bengal to be divided, were trumped by Congress, because Congress felt, having seen the elections of 35 and 46, that because of the Muslim predominance in demographic terms, that they will never be able to perhaps have power, because the three chief ministers of Bengal are all Muslims. So that was the tension. So all these things then get blown up into essentialist category, that we are ultimately Hindus, or ultimately Muslims, or ultimately Bengalis. There's another way of looking at it, which is in terms of nationalism, that people express nationalism taking on the Bengali thing, or the Bangladeshi thing, or the Islam thing, and politically they articulate that and sort of bring in identities to fulfill those political goals.
So it's constructed. And
it is constructed.
And it is strategically mobilized. And I think that's what,
So in some sense, the notion itself is something like people asking me, do you eat fish or meat? I eat both.
Exactly.
So I Bangladesh theory is neither here nor there. But I agree with the thrust of your analysis. It's very interesting.
Thank you. We'll move on. Dr. Fuad Ali is next on the agenda, so I'll let you speak.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm not a historian, I'm a geographer, and I have some experience in Bangladesh where I was looking at how people live beside the Jagonari River, which erodes their homes, and how politics and technology and communities adapt. I want to start with a quote from Ali Shariati, the great revolutionary thinker, in a speech on extraction and refinement of cultural resources. He talks about the following: a generation looking for a way to solve its economic and cultural spiritual problems and to transform its society into a progressive and creative one must possess a historical and cultural awareness as well as a techno-scientific know-how. This does not mean that it should merely emulate another progressive society. Rather, it must possess an independent experience and original principles and virtues with a new mission moving forward its goal. I actually didn't read until the end of the, I'm not a historian, I don't read very carefully. I didn't see there's something else, so I was just playing with the four identities. Ali Shariati really thought through a lot of things about left thinking, about Islamic thinking, and he reformed Shiism. Unfortunately, he didn't get to see revolutionary Iran, but I think this essay on culture is very, very important. Wouldn't it be great if we could get into a time machine and visit a critical point in our history to enable a better present? Take 1957. We could rout the invading British Army, mobilize reinforcements, and liberate the Europeans from such plundersome imperialism. Climate change wouldn't be such a problem. We could take the TARDIS, because Doctor Who is probably the British representation of Sayyidina Khidr, the green one. who was blessed with the knowledge of the unseen and took Musa alayhi salam, or Moses, on a mysterious adventure of boat sinking, killing, and wall restoration, before leaving him with nothing but an explanation. There are a couple of questions that I always used to get into on the internet. What are you first, Muslim or Bengali? What are you first, Muslim or British? I've been quiet to answer, Takbir, Allah Akbar, if the questions were at face value. I think, like Nazneen, it's important to reject the questions and graduate from them. The 4 categories in our title are different in kind. They're interactive. One is religious conviction, a universal faith with resources like revelation, prophecy, and several disciplines of knowledge which have been accumulating for hundreds of years. Another is an ethnic, racial, linguistic base, rendered frozen by the British. They used to refer to the Bengalis as effete, disloyal, intellectual types. Nearly always they'd be referring to Hindus. We only start using it, some of us only start using it when oppressed by another category. The Bangladeshi identity, it's a second attempt at a post-colonial nationalism. So you got the scars from previous ones and colonization affecting it. There's a date. I'm going to stay in the near field of history because I want to. The 15th of August, right, is a very confusing date in Bangladesh. In 1947, the 14th of August, Laylatul Qadr, the night of power, the Quran starts to be revealed. It marks partition. Then several years later, it marks the kind of assassination of Mujibur Rahman and most of his family. So it's a really interesting tension point. There's always a lot of self-immolation in the newspapers. If you read the Daily Star, they do their thing. If you read Bangla, so I suppose they do their thing. Because the 15th of August is also the foundation of India. So it's an interesting date. If you ever want to look at what Bangladesh thinks of itself, look at the press on that date. And then we come to the British category, an old colonizer, a present neo-colonizer, with the decaying welfare provision in which we sit as awkward immigrants to be extradited at any time. So these 4 interacting identities, sometimes they make each other, and they see each other differentially depending on the powers and desires that hold on to them. For example, we might have a force here that would like to commodify Islam, rendering rituals to be, cultural products. Perhaps twinning Ramadan with the Olympics. This is what happened. You'll also get the power of the census in pretty much making Hinduism, clumping together a load of disparate communities under Hinduism. There's a sociology of that, and tomorrow Abdul Chaudhry will probably talk about it a bit. Now, marginalised by the Brahminical British complex, we asserted Muslimness. Rather, many of our grandfathers and great-grandfathers did. Then, facing difficulties from the Pakistani state and the retentiveness of the Muslim League, we asserted Bengalians. Rather, many of our grandfathers and fathers did. There's a generational thing there, and I'm probably wrong. However, it's interesting to see every generation looks at what it's got, is thoroughly dissatisfied and wants to overhaul it. If we're to look at each of the 4 identities from the point of view of another identity, it's quite a lot of fun. Look with a Muslim lens at British. What does that mean? From a point of view of religion, it's an audience. The Muslim is there to pass on the message. From the historical point of view, we see it as a colonizer and an existing threat. Presently at war in several Muslim countries. Then we look at Bangla. Bangla is a language that was often written in the Arabic script back in the day. Islamic parties have had difficulty with Bangla in the past to their detriment. Then we look at Bangladesh. And that could be seen as the Muslim half of a greater Bengal, if you're inclined to think that way. 150 million Muslims. If you look at the British view of what a Bangladeshi is, you could see it as a region of developmentia through which to prosecute anti-poverty programs, often through British Bangladeshi personnel. Some of us might find ourselves in that entanglement. I'll go on to some example later on. I think a lot of dead-end discussions, are you Bangla first or Muslim first, they might evaporate if we refuse to be dragged into other people's nationalist myth-making. I'm not particularly adherent to either Bengali or Bangladeshi nationalism. I believe that a lot of people are waiting for the next chapter, hopefully for the future, for some decolonial politics, for some Imran Khan type figure to galvanize that kind of thinking, because I think they've reached their course and now these people are just making money out of being poor. These identities, they nourish a politics of death. I want to talk about the contested history of Bangladesh now. We've had two national creation events, Pakistan and then Bangladesh. Arguably, more people have been killed by us in famines than during these wars. In the recent past, we see on our TV screens how these political myths of founders, sometimes even borrowing Muslim terms. Have you heard of Jar Khalifa, the four Khalifas of Mujibur Rahman? Mujibur Rahman becomes a prophet, Nauzubillah, and his four lieutenants are the Khalifas. It's in the folk sense-making apparatus to reproduce Muslim tropes. Yeah. Okay.
He was not a prophet, but the Jar Khalifas are in mockery. Muslims will say that.
Interesting, I didn't know that. Don't think that changes anything. Okay. We'll see how people's status is intertwined in the narrative of Bangladesh creation. Every time there is an exercise of ritual nose counting, the publishing industry does very well as new textbooks are created, histories are erased, created, villains, heroes. It's rubbish because there are about 7 or 8 sides to us. And they all move through us. They all move through us. Even if we don't want them to. Some families this is represented more than others. So I remember when I was doing my fieldwork from 2005 to 2007, there were certain events that really shocked me, and I wanted to talk about this because it's how history forms identity, and these shook me to my core. On the 26th of September 2006, a friend, an older teacher, Professor Ahmed, was gunned down in his apartment. He was a political science professor at Tauke University. He was the kind of guy who was a lefty student, a lot of people are, and during the 1970 struggle he was coining phrases about rivers and Joe Bama, that kind of thing. He did his PhD in 1983 from the University of London on the Mujib era of politics. He was a political in-swinger from left to right. He became more devoted to a Muslim political identity. And he was gunned down. But this wasn't before suggesting that we change our national anthem, because, we could do better than Tagore. It would be more appropriate to have something else, which caused his office to be burnt down. So he was gunned down, and the secular liberal intelligentsia said nothing. Right? This confirmed a couple of things to me. On the 28th of October 2006, we saw things. I'd returned to London at this stage. We saw scenes of the opposition, the Awami League, jumping on the dead bodies of Islamists. Really, really strange. So I really am flabbergasted at the continual reproduction of Bangladeshi political motifs amongst our community here. I understand that it's a box to tick, but I don't think I'll tick that box. I don't even tick the Muslim box. I want to mess it up. There's some articles of hope, you know. Maulana Bhashani, at the age of 90, is a man that one of our colleagues is doing a whole PhD on. Expect some interesting knowledge creation from her. 90 years old, he spans pretty much all of these national creation events and speaks through them. At the age of 90, in May 1976, he did a Faraka Long March. You know, this to me is a politics of hope, not despair. The first partition of Bengal, 1905 to 1911, was interesting too. It kind of nurtures a Bengali Muslim middle class. It's campaigned against by people like Tagore, but as compensation, the British has helped establish the Dhaka University, which, you know, is something. The British government has given in to terrorism on 2 occasions, one from the Zionists and one from the Swadeshi movement. This is what we're dealing with here, you know. Let me say as well. Another one. I was studying public engineering in Bangladesh, and I like it when our political leaders say something constructive and creative, like Kalkato, dig canals, sort out irrigation problems. And I saw one project, which was a Tista Barrage project, which for some reason was funded for 10 years by Bangladeshi money and Bangladeshi expertise, and it still stands as an object of pride. If anything were to happen to this barrage, all of the engineers in the country would go and plug it with their own bodies. This was no World Bank scheme. So I think in solving our economic and cultural, spiritual problems, there's a link here with, you know, creative engagement with the environment. As we see, as we can probably foretell, climate change will be another layer of messed upness to an already toxic political environment. I think the politics of the future will be on the environment, and you won't see it from a DFID fund, you won't see it from us. Anyway, something on entangled events, because this is when things really mess up the 4 categories. Anwar Chaudhry was appointed British High Commissioner for Bangladesh for a number of years. British, Bengali, Bangladeshi, Muslim. A tool of what forces? That's something to discuss. In April 2008, there's another one, the beating of Rizwan Hussain, the TV personality at the Dhaka airport. You know, 4 identities really smashed together there. What's going on? Not to mention the murders of Surat Mia and Mughal Qureshi at airports in Bangladesh. Wouldn't it be nice to imagine a Bangladesh political leadership that would protect us from the excesses of the British state? I referred to the case, the extradition case of Talal Assad, who's just been packed off to America after fighting for 6 years to have a trial in this country. However, you can see the opposite. You can actually conceive of a Bangladesh politics that would exploit that to raise the spectre of Islamic terrorism in Bangladesh, and I'm sure that's what they're doing. Then take the recent election in this area of a Bangladeshi Muslim MP. You have the Prime Minister of Bangladesh ordering her party workers in the area to line up behind the campaign of the Labour Party. Interesting interaction of identities: Bengali, Bangladeshi, British, Muslim. Or the other way, people here from the Hizb ut-Tahrir party setting up in Bangladesh and really confusing the establishment that doesn't really know what to do with Islamists, but call them collaborators or terrorists. I mention these because I'd like to urge us not to feed the monsters and not to contribute to further retardation of these composite collectivisms. More Ahmedullahs, more Hussein Haidars, less Ed Husseins, less Shahriar Kabirs, inshallah.
Thank you, Fuad.
I'm letting people talk for more than 5 minutes because there is a lot to say and a lot of history to refer to, but only points of clarification at this stage, because I think otherwise we'll...
Just factual. You mentioned there are a lot of things on after. I mean, that I think it's factually wrong. That you imply that he was killed because of his political positions, and you also alluded to the fact that he had moved from the extreme left to the extreme right, which I don't think is right. Because his political stand was very, very clear, and he was very difficult to categorize because he was the guy who coined the slogan Jagonari, and he was the guy who raised the flag. So there was an attempt, because he was against the ruling regime at the point in time, and he also queried why a particular song of the girl became the national anthem and not another song of the general army, which are relevant things to raise. And you yourself mentioned that there are 7 or 8 ways of looking at things, and you did not follow your own instructions to some extent. And the factual thing is that Aftab's position was very clear, that in 71 I fought against Pakistan because Pakistan did not want an independent Bangladesh. Today politics has turned full circle, and India doesn't want an independent Bangladesh, so I'm against India. So it was a political position rather than a move from extreme left to extreme right. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think the position should be very clear. And the death has nothing to do, perhaps. We don't know who killed him. It could be personal. Some people say it was an inter-PNP quarrel. We don't know. So alluding that there is something definitive that he was killed because of something is actually far-fetched. Yeah, I mean, there are other issues that look great now. That I think should be factually corrected. And the reason I say that is because I knew Ahmed very good friend of ours. And I had talks with him. In fact, I visited him when he was under great trouble because of his comments of the national anthem. But he's somebody you respect. You might not agree with him, but that was his position.
Thanks for that comment. Dr. Georgie, Wemyss, I think everyone is familiar to many people in this room who've come through it before. Can I just throw in a question? As you taught in this area, we have a lot of stuff about history of Bangladesh identity in referring to Bangladeshis in diaspora and in Bangladesh. But I suppose, how does all that feed into people living in this area?
Well, just a quick response to that. I don't teach in schools, but I've taught in college, and I can just reiterate really what Nazneen said when you took the young people on the tour of Brick Lane. That I set up a course called South Asian Studies in Town College, which has been running for about the last almost 20 years. And the aim of the course, it was just a module and an access course for adults who were going to progressive art university. And predominantly it would be people from Bangladeshi backgrounds who would choose to do that module. And I would say that 95% of people who did that course were extremely ignorant of the kind of histories that we've been talking about and hadn't had the opportunity to be exposed to it in schools here at all. And part of what we did, for example, for that course, was that every year we would go for a walk around the East India Docks, a walk that I've done for Brick Lane Circle as well, just making the link, the hundreds of years linked between Bengal and East London, which kind of acted as a spark for the young people to then, talk about their own family history, go back to their parents. When I say young people, they weren't necessarily that young, they were adults, but some of them were in their sort of late teens. Of course, the people who knew the most were people who had been educated in Bangladesh and had at least learned something about British colonialism and that history and their curriculum there. So just, I won't talk for very long, but some of you who don't know me might well be thinking, okay, we're talking about Bangladeshi Bengali identities, so what am I doing sitting here? But one reason is that Ahmedullah, when he asked me, the title was The Role of History and Identity, and I don't think it mentioned what identity was, so I was going to talk quite theoretically about it. But the other reason, which some people will know about as well, is that my husband is from Bangladesh, and my children, who are now 15 and 17, have been growing up in East London. And although, like I think everybody else here, I have got a kind of visceral resistance to the box ticking and the kind of the idea of single identities, which has thankfully become multiple identities and flexible identities. And personally, I've been able to ignore it. As my children have been growing up and going through the school system, they've been, constantly fired with questions. Not necessarily that they're meant to be not well-meaning, asking them about what their identity is, and they've had to work out ways for themselves of how they're going to respond to that. And really, my own understanding of the issues comes from being their mother and trying to help them through that. And this is when we're in Bangladesh as well, on holiday as well as when we're here, but predominantly when we're here. And also my own academic interests, which, as an anthropologist, I've been an anthropologist of British nationalism. And the subject of my research has been the kind of, the way that politicians and media and people talk about Britain and Britishness has been to silence many of the histories of violence of the British Empire and the links through that between people from the subcontinent, obviously from other parts of the world as well, but I'm focusing on that here, and the histories going back, and the kind of effect that can have on people's idea of belonging here and in other parts of the world today. So it kind of all comes together in that, and I think that my own children's view of who they are is also influenced by the fact that these histories and these discussions are very live in our household. And they're constantly asking questions about it. So as a starting point, I just wanted to throw in the name of a sociologist who you might have heard of. He's called John Goldthorpe, and he came up with a phrase which I think is really apt, and you can kind of keep it in your head. And he says that he sort of warns sociologists when they're writing about issues like this that not to do a pick and mix from history's sweet shop. So what he's meaning is that when we talk about something like identity, that we can't just pick any bit of history and put it together, because like statistics, we can choose almost anything to support our argument. We need to be much more sophisticated than that. We have to have some sort of justification or reason for why we choose particular versions. And the other thing is that, of course, memory itself is contested, and that when memories are being contested, what that means is that at least at the level of government and memorial, some things are remembered and other things are forgotten, and we all know about the memorials that exist and the ones that don't. For example, the memorial down at the Tower of London to the Indian seafarers, where only those people who were employed on British articles are on that memorial, and everybody else is forgotten. So memory is very contested, and the memories that I've been very interested in looking at are the hidden histories of empire, which they're probably not so hidden to people in this room, but as we've seen when you're out and about on these walks, etc., they're just not there. And just to bring it to mind, all of us here must have been seeing the recent events in the courts here, where some very elderly Kenyan people who were victims of torture under British colonial rule are now being able to have a proper hearing in this country, and their kind of identity has changed from being criminals under the British state to now being victims of the criminality of the British state at that time. So it's kind of, those histories have been very hidden for a long time, and now, because of the politics of the moment, it looks, we're having different memories associated with that. So there's one thing about this whole politics of memory and what we use. And the other thing, area that I just wanted to focus on is it kind of links in with what everybody else is saying as well, but I'm being less specific about Bangladesh or Bengal. And that is a historian called Sanjay Subramanian, who wrote a book back in the 1990s, where he called for connected histories. And there's a lot of work that's been done since then, which is focusing on this idea of connected histories. So what he was doing was criticising the way that, because of the links with colonialism of the history, academic departments, etc., area studies had come to dominate. So you would get, Indianists and Africanists, and so area studies meant that the links between the different parts of the globe were not being focused on. Instead, there was this kind of nationalism of ethnography and history. And I think, that many of the debates around identity and who we are now have also grown out of that kind of area studies type of approach. So, I mean, he said something which, again, I really like the imagery that he used. He said historians need to seek out the fragile threads that connected the globe, even as the globe came to be defined as such. So he's kind of talking around the sort of early years of colonialism and the Enlightenment, etc., and calling on us to look at how peoples were connected at that time and how that has developed and changed up to the present day. So I like to keep that in our minds. And that links also in terms of philosophy and intellectual activity as well. In the same way that there have been connections through trade, there's also been intellectual connections. So when we think about the ways European philosophy, European culture, we don't think of it in terms of something which hasn't been influenced by other intellectual debates that have been happening in South Asia and East Asia, and using these area studies labels, the Middle East, etc. So we're constantly live to all of these connections and all of these multiple interpretations of things. And the reason that I feel all of this so strongly, just bring it back to what I said at the beginning, is again to do with my children, and not just them. They come from a particular combination of backgrounds. And I know through their experience in schools that there are many, many, many other children who are partly Bengali and partly something else, and plus, so many other different mixtures. And in order to, support them when they're trying to assert themselves as being recognised as they want to be recognised, and not to be having unwanted identities thrown on them, that we should make sure that the debates, keep this level of sophistication and openness about them. So I won't say anything more now, because obviously we want to move on to a discussion and go into more depth.
Thank you, Georgie. Last but not least, thanks, Ruhul. You're not a doctor, right?
No,
I'm sure he's got something to say. So.
thank you very much. I really wanted to hear your sort of individual perspectives and the oral history that you guys have brought to the table. My background is architecture and planning, so it's sort of almost not really sort of people-led, it's more sort of environment and space-led. The sort of, what I'd like to bring to the conversation is the role of history in how we sort of put forward an idea of identity. I'd like to sort of maybe touch on sort of 2 or 3 stories, so just sort of understand how Bangladeshis, Bengalis, British, and sort of my own sort of perspective on this comes across. So we were sort of traveling last year in Bangladesh, and one of the things we were doing was we were interviewing people in the hill tracks. And what we asked them to do is we asked them to do a very simple task, which was to say, can you please say your name and say where you're from and you're happy to be Bangladeshi. And we asked maybe 5 or 10 different ethnic groups in the tracks. And one or two said, yes, my name is XX Chakma or XX Mama, and I'm proud to be Bangladeshi. And then, as we go further along and we encounter some of the older people, they refused to say Bangladeshi or Bengali. And we didn't press them for why that was, because we understand the deeper history that comes with that. And we said, okay, cool, that's obviously still going on. And when we're being shown around the hill tribes by a young sort of traveller with us, he was referring to the tribes, the people, the indigenous communities, as Upajatis. So he was sort of labeling them. He must have been about 12 or 13. He was saying, oh, these Upajatis, they don't know anything, ignore them, etc. So I sort of want sort of exposure to Bangladesh and issues of identity politics that exists currently, which has been impacted by the history that the region has had. Another story that I got sort of is on the other side of Bangladesh, which is a lady that we interviewed. She was living in Kushtia, so you know Bangladesh, Kushtia. She didn't call herself a Lalon sort of follower, but she was dedicated to one of the shrines that was in Kushtia. And she went through her history, so she got married off really young, at sort of age of 13, and she was sort of discarded out to sort of the Middle East, where her husband was very, very abusive to her, so she came back somehow, and she decided to dedicate her life to this shrine. And so when we were interviewing her and asking her to tell us her story, and we asked her, well, how do you identify yourself now? And she just said, I'm just a human being, and all I want to do is embrace love, and I don't want to have any of this caste issues and problems. And my daughter, who's now 13, has married off. She has a child, so I'm a grandmother, I'm 35. I cannot deal with all these identity issues. I just want to be a human being and I'll be able to love people for who they are. So that's another story. And then another story that I want to sort of bring to the table is we were in Madhapur in the sort of Dhaka National Forest, and we were talking to some of the Garo tribes there. And it was really interesting. What was really interesting there was that there was a church there. And sort of the way the church has obviously worked in the past in South Asia has been that they come in, they convert people, they make sure everyone's a Christian, and then they sort of have their following. What was happening was that there was a mosque nearby which was doing something similar. And the tribal leader was telling us how they were really confused as to what to do because they had their own animistic religion that they were happy to follow, centuries old. And then there was this church that had come in sort of the 50s, planted themselves, was giving them food, was giving them names, so they were now all of a sudden they were called John and Chris. And it was sort of really fascinating. And then all of a sudden there's a mosque. So the mosque had popped up in the last sort of 2 decades, and it was trying to convert everybody again. So they were really, really confused as to what to do. And that's obviously your politics, and you've got to deal with it as best as you can. And we sort of left that. So that's sort of a whirlwind sort of introduction to how Bangladesh was sort of very, very diverse and plural, and trying to contest within all the different spaces we were visiting. And if we sort of come back here, so to my own sort of personal story. So I was only exposed to Bangladesh maybe at the age of 16, 17, really, as a sort of young person. I thought, well, actually, who am I, what am I doing, and what's my history? So I sort of started looking and Googling and trying to figure out what Bangladesh was. It sort of confused me a lot then. So one of the things that I did was an art project on the Liberation War. And in that, it was just sort of, what it was just an exposure to me. So I was like, wow, this is Bangladesh, and this is what Pakistan did, and I was like, oh, what do I do? So I sort of invested all my time into creating a mural, which my mom had thrown away now because it was sort of very evil, she said. So she said, it's not worth keeping in the house, it's not nice. And so, okay, fair enough. I mean, so I continued, so I went through that process, and then I said, okay, cool. How do we really then label ourselves? How can we sort of call ourselves anything more than just a human being? And as soon as we sort of start putting British, Bangladeshi, Bengali, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, whatever it may be, as soon as we start adding that label to ourselves, and then we have to sort of defend it, fight it, whatever it may be. So I said, okay, cool. I'm not going to defend myself against another person because they're of a different sort of identity. It doesn't really make any sense to me. So the role of history to me then sort of it's very interesting. So the more I read, the more I expose myself to the Bengal history, the British history, the wider world history. It sort of makes me re-question who I am. So I'll read something and I'll sort of re-question, and then So it's a continuous process that where I say, well, actually, hang on, I can't really give myself one static identity, as we sort of said. It changes with who you are and who you're with, even sometimes. And mine is sort of the tick boxing exercise that we're forced to do almost. We're pretty much free to think whatever we want. But I think one of the things I've talked to people about a lot over the sort of last couple of months is that the role of almost cultural history, because it's almost very, very different to political history and social history, and how sort of the cultural religious histories that we're sort of brought up in really challenges how we go forward. And one of the things I was sort of thinking about sort of a couple of weeks back was when we're so as we're young, we go to the madrasa for the education, Islamic studies, Quran studies, and we're in a school, so we're being exposed to 3-4 different histories all at the same time. And at one point, there's the Bengali history that comes in and sort of plants itself. So the struggle that I had was convincing my parents on the first time to be able to go to Bangladesh, because they said it's not a good place to go. And I said, okay, but I mean, it's part of who we are, and I need to understand myself. And they said, no, you don't need to go there, it's not very safe. But you talk about it in such a poetic way, it sounds wonderful. I mean, of course, I want to go and see it for myself. You don't need to go, it's not a nice place. So you've almost sort of changed your sort of stance overnight. And so I think the struggles that we have as a sort of a hybrid identity, which is a British, a Bangladeshi, sometimes Muslim, sometimes not Muslim, and whatever it may be, sort of really puts forward extreme sort of pressures on ourselves to just almost choose, and we're continuously forced to choose an identity rather than sort of actually it will change and it will grow. Let us sort of have it in the way you say. You've got to let them pick themselves, let your children sort of decide for themselves over time, and it will continually change. So yeah, it's an interesting position, because I think I don't want to say I'm sort of 100% British or 100% Bangladeshi or 100%. I don't think I'm Bengali as far as my parents have said. I'm Sileti, so they always look to the other as Bengali, and so that I've always found really interesting, because I say, well, hang on, aren't we all Bangladeshi? And so that sets up a whole different conversation in the sort of household. So I'd like to end there. I mean, I think there's plenty to sort of talk about it, and I'd like to hear what you have to say as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruhul, and thank you to all the speakers for bringing their expert knowledge, but also bringing an open mind and gelling so well together in terms of bringing maximum amount of thoughts in the shortest amount of time to do it. We've got a good half an hour or so, but I'll just keep the question sort of set short and just take a few questions and then let people talk informally. So I'd like to start there.
Can I start? Mine's a very practical point, is that I've heard all the historical context, and I love all the diversity of arguments. But if I can focus on one thing, is we came to this country in 1964, and since then we've been through a lot of labelling here in this country, and the pride of being born in Bangladesh has never left me, but the pain of being labelled what I have been labelled in this country hasn't left me either. And I could honestly say that until recently, all the bad things that happened to Bangladeshis in the UK, we bore the label of Bangladeshis, never abandoned it, because it does happen to us, and we do things ourselves that I'm not always too proud of. But we remain Bangladeshi. I think what I would like is to remain Bangladeshi in this country, because now when I see fantastic things that are finally emerging done by Bangladeshis, let's not abandon that term. Let's not abandon saying that we're Bangladeshis and call ourselves Indians, Asians, Bengalis. I see a place for that, but after such a long struggle in this country, and having happily borne the label of Bangladeshi, I don't want to abandon it now and to go into other identities that actually you lose that boundary that you came from 71, and that created you, and that you bring here, and you carry forth.
Does anybody disagree with that, just by that one? No?
I don't really disagree with it. Just a question for Professor My observation of what's happening to the Bengali community is that we have a kind of a polarized community of young generation where some are leaning more towards kind of religious kind of a formulated identity where they believe that they're solely British or solely Muslim, despite the fact that they originate from Bangladesh and their parents are from Bangladesh. And then we have another set of young generation of people who are more leaning towards a very kind of non, religious but more integrated or assimilated identity. It's a question to you. How do you see it? Do you think that from an anthropological perspective, what's your perception of that? I mean, where is the community heading to? The Bengali young generation of people heading? Which direction are they heading to? Yeah, it's a question to you.
It's just that what I would say, I don't know about an anthropological perspective, but a personal perspective, is that young people don't have the opportunity to hear some of the kinds of things that people on this panel have been saying. So this idea that, I mean, all of us have said that we reject the idea of a single identity and we reject the idea of having an identity thrust upon us, or what you were saying just now about being able to choose different identities in different contexts. And sometimes it can make it sound like we're being very manipulative if we appear as one thing in one context and one thing in another, but that's not actually how it works. It's just that the situation that you're in means that you know, different parts of yourself are expressed. And I think that from my experience of what's happening with young people is that they're not enough exposed to the option of being able to feel relaxed about having different identities and being able to choose those. And there's too many people outside saying you've got to fit in that box. And so what I'm saying is probably what you're saying when you set up this panel as well, as Brick Lane Circle, is just to widen the opportunities for young people to make some choices.
So can I contribute something? In that respect, I do kind of agree with what this lady had to say, so I don't know your name. But I also believe that we also have to cherish the fact that we live in a multicultural society and we do have a hyphenated identity as well. We're not just Bangladeshi. Some of us are, we're a religion, some of us are Muslim, Hindus or whatever, Christians. But there should be, for me, I take it as I'm British, Muslim and Bangladeshi. So that's my three identities, not just solely Bangladeshi.
Can I just point out one thing? Like we're talking about polarization. If you call yourself Bengali, then the other side will say, oh, you are Indian agent, or you worship Calcutta. If you say you are Muslim, Islamic, the other side will say you are a Razaka, right? Or you Pakistani, support Pakistan during the war. But it's not, it's really complicated. Sometimes it's quite bad as well. And there's a lot of tension. It's not just a matter of, okay, you are Bengali, I'm Muslim, Bangladeshi, but there's a lot of consequences of these polarized identities. And in Bangladesh, there's a lot of violence take place as a result of this.
To back, just after that.
I just wanted to ask the panel to elaborate on the point that if somebody asks you a question, about your identity, it's a very loaded question, isn't it? They're wanting to elicit some sort of response. Do you unpack that?
Yeah, latency. Depending on the power situation, I guess I'd respond depending on who's got the power and what point I'm trying to make. I'd say that. But normally I just go to very long or in your face. I don't get off on singing any non-national or British ones. Yeah. But that's the politics of our time requires that. Plus, if it's like God on the Day of Judgment, it's kind of academic realism.
I think Mia's raised a point about urban identities or local identities, and that's not, and I think Ruhul did as well when talking about being Sylheti, and when you ask someone where your dish is, you know, that's a really specifically kind of gendered, specifically located. It's not like someone asks you where your dish is, you're talking about where your father's kind of ancestors.
They ask you where your body is.
Yeah, where your body is, right? It's really specific, and it's, you know, if I say mine is Jagonari, which is in North Sydney, then someone will say to me, my family come from that village, you know, and so that's one particular way. So if I'm asked sometimes by somebody who's loaded that question particularly loaded, where are you from? You know, sometimes I'll be really mischievous and I'll say, I live in Southampton. And then they'll say, no, where are you really from? And I say, well, I grew up in Red Hills. And they'll say, no, where are you really, really, really from? And I say, I was born in North London. And, you know, it's quite fun sometimes to actually play that game because you know what they really want to pin you down in terms of your ethnicity. And you don't have to do it, you know, you don't have to, you know, if you don't want to, that's not, you don't have to do that. So, but then at the same time, there are other situations where I'll be very proud to say I'm Bangladeshi, and that's and it comes down to that power situation. If someone is really trying to put you into a particular box, or whether you can actually, you know, define it yourself and you declaring it and kind of setting it. So, yeah, I think it's interesting that it's very contextual.
Thank you for the response you've given. It seems to me that you've never been asked that loaded question in an environment that's particularly dangerous, like the context that you're giving here, where, you know, your answer could actually signal what your political allegiance is, and there are all sorts of drastic consequences that can happen from that.
No,
It's a really nice position to be in.
Yeah, I've done that. But my father, my parents, my grandfather wasn't necessarily the same. So.
With me, I usually say, should we continue? Or?
Yes, no.
Okay, and with me, I usually say I'm a human being, so I sort of leave it at that. But when people do ask, they say, oh, from the north, and then I, well, you don't have the accent. So, okay, from the north of England, which one know. But then, yeah, I'm very happy to say I'm from Bangladesh. I was born there, so it's not a big deal. And one time I was on a train ride in sort of, I think, from Kolkata to Delhi, and my fellow passenger was a fellow Indian, I guess, and he asked me, oh, where are you from? I said, oh, I'm from Bangladesh. He's like, well, no, you're not. And I was like, what do you mean I'm not from Bangladesh? He goes, oh, you don't sound like a Bangladeshi. I said, well, don't I look like one? And he goes, yeah, but you don't sound like this. Where are you from? I said, well, I live in England at the moment. He goes, okay. And then he asked what religion I was, and I said, well, what's that got to do with anything? And then he goes, oh, are you ashamed of your religion? Is that why you're not telling me? And I go, well, I'm not going to tell you because it's irrelevant. I mean, it doesn't matter. And he did push for a little while, and I just thought, well, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. It's okay, just go away. But I guess you're right in terms of being challenged that, or who are you, why are you here, kind of thing. And you get that quite a lot. And what was interesting was the project we're doing with sort of the Urdu speaking community in Bangladesh and Dhaka with the sort of known as the Bengalis. We were in the camps walking around photographing. And we were challenged and saying, well, what are you doing here? You don't belong here, get out. And so, well, no. And I was with a fellow student who just said, well, actually, we're all Bangladeshis. We have every right to be here. And the community member said, well, no, there's a gate there. And it says specifically, you aren't allowed in. So, well, no, there is no gate. We're allowed in. We do whatever we want. It's Bangladesh. We're all Bangladeshis. It's antagonistic, challenging, and whatever else is not really useful for anybody. And I've only ever really been sort of, so being brought up north, we've been called a lot of things, but usually it always revolves around the word Paki. I say, look, I'm not from Pakistan, just don't call me that. I mean, just common courtesy. If you're going to insult me, at least insult me properly. But so things like that, I think, I think because London is so multicultural and it's so diverse, and sort of the last decade has really given us something to be, I guess not proud of, but I think we're quite happy to say, well, we're all from here or there, wherever else, because everybody else is from here or there, or somewhere else. It's quite easy to blend in London, but when you're outside of London and you see a different context, then that challenge is very real. So well, actually, if you're not from here, then you need to sort of get the hell out or something like that. So it's tough, usually.
Yeah, I mean, the power politics, the race politics in London just shows in this way, in that I'm rarely asked about what my identity is. And compared to everybody else here, I can imagine that, it just doesn't happen. And I think that's a really significant point, but I wish that it would. I wish that people would ask me, because then it would provide me with a route into having all sorts of discussions about empire violence and all of that. Because my mum was born in Bombay, because her father was in the British Army, part of the people suppressing the Quit India movement. My dad was born in Colombo in Sri Lanka, because his dad was managing a tea plantation, and before that he was in the Indian Army, throwing grenades in Iraq during the end of the First World War. My grandfather was born in Mauritius. So, and then I would go back and I would talk about the fact that our family is originally from Scotland, and we were, part of the mass migrations of the 19th century, when people from Scotland went and they took lots of these posts of the expanding colonial empire. And, we came back and we were allowed to be British and, white British, because we could just blend in. Now, in the late 1960s, in order to try and keep out the Asian people who were living in Kenya, the Immigration Act, or whichever the act was called, it changed the status of my father, who had thought that he was British, and who suddenly applied for a passport and said, no, sorry, you're Mauritian, you're not British, we can't give you a passport. So he then had to go through a whole process of becoming British on the basis of the fact that he was born in present-day Sri Lanka and his father had been born in Mauritius. And if people asked me about my identity, I would be able to then, go and describe some of these histories. And in fact, for me, finding out about all of these colonial histories and how it impacted on not just the lives of people in Sri Lanka or Mauritius or in India, but also back here, is one of the things that has kind of led me into the sort of work that I've been doing as well.
It's such a simple question.
Yeah.
We're short of time, so I think there were a couple of people who put their hands up before. It's interesting with the gender aspect of that question, where you're from, well, there's a class aspect as well, and whether or not you're from London or not, the stories in London, you kind of expect that complexity.
Yeah.
But
Even
if you're brought up with a different mono or bi,
the idea of being an East Londoner as well, and that is a very kind of, I was talking to Julie Beggar, and she was saying that there's a really proud kind of identity here, that if you were born in East London, you're an East Londoner, and this kind of sense that is shared between, regardless of your ethnicity or your religion, it's actually being born here, and this kind of really proud sort of claiming of this kind of rebellious spirit of the East End, that you can only claim it if you're actually born here. And so I'm always
when you faced with the question, where are you from, just before you when you said, like, you would kind of go around the topic, approach it like, and not kind of get to the point just to see how people's responses are. But why wouldn't you just answer it directly? Is it because you think that you're revealing more of your identity?
No,
or is it because it's something that's personal to you?
It depends on who's asking, really. I mean, sometimes it's loaded with that kind of sense of a slightly racist kind of. You can tell when someone's doing it in a hostile way. In that situation, as a form of kind of resistance, I suppose, I would refuse to kind of feel, satisfy their curiosity. So.
Okay, who wants to start? 3 or 4 hands that I see. Shall we all ask more at once and then have one last round up, or people work that kind of time? Usually we'll keep asking.
It's not so much a question, it's more of like an observation. I think in terms of identity, especially with regards to being Bangladeshi or being Bengali, I think there is a new wave of thinking where people are actually becoming quite sick and tired of being constantly labelled as one thing or the other, and so they're sort of like reducing the label and just calling themselves human being. And also I think it's to do it like if, so for example, I'm a Silti Bengali Muslim. When I was in school, I went to school for the Pakistanis and Indians, And I was very much like Bangladesh, because I constantly received very negative remarks about Bangladesh. I was to be told, oh, you're quite tall for a Bengali, or quite fair for a Bengali. So I was to be like, yeah, I'm Bengali. And it was very much in your face attitude. But then when I got older and I was in an environment where it was all about Bangladesh, I actually became kind of like, no, this is too much. So it's like, I think identity sort of changes, and this emotional aspect of identity, which is very common, perhaps in many different parts of the world, but I noticed that a lot in South Asia, and I don't think it's healthy. So this emotional, like this, oh, we're Bangladeshi, so many people died for the war, and we should remember, you know, who we are, our past. I think it causes a lot of division as well, especially in England, where you are living next door to Pakistanis and Indians. It's not always healthy. And you see that on Facebook, like even on the Independence Day of India and Pakistan, or even recently, like the whole cricket match between India and Pakistan. I'm so proud to be a Pakistani even though they lost, and India's all, I'm so proud to be Indian. And it's quite silly. And you see, there are time and place, but I think identity in some places is important, but it is becoming quite, I don't know, like it doesn't have any benefit sometimes.
It's very interesting. What the ties in you were talking about being proud or wanting to hold on to the term Bangladeshi, because I guess non-Bangladeshis, they see a Bangladeshi face and they see British Muslim or British Asian, and the Bangladeshiness that you feel is sort of lost. But sort of ties in a bit with that sort of point. Can we just go around the other people who wanted to speak and then give us panelists?
I'm just going to carry on with what you said, actually. I came to this country in the late 60s, and I had a Sikh friend down the road, I had a Muslim friend down the road, I had a black friend, white friend. And I actually didn't know what the difference was between my Sikh and my Muslim friend. And we were perceived by the white community as Asian, in the good term, and the P word in the bad term. So we were all lumped together, both, in terms of perception and in terms of racism. There was no difference between us. It didn't matter you were wearing a turban or you covered your legs or you didn't. The colour of your skin, the food that you ate, actually, which has a lot of commonality between all the people in North India and Bangladesh and Pakistan. So I come from an Indian background. So, and I don't call myself Hindu because I don't want that label, because my beliefs are my own personal beliefs. I would say I'm pagan in a sense of thinking that the natural forces are God. And if that's my belief, I don't want to be labelled by somebody else saying that I'm this or that. And I think that's the problem that we have, and that if we look at history, I think history, particularly for South Asia, in terms of identity, is that, in 1757 there was a battle of Plassey, started the whole division, the conquest, the divisions, eventually that happened in 1947, that, all these divisions, where we have India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, they are man-made constructs. And even before that, there were different principalities, there were different kingdoms, and so who are we to say, and that's my thing, who am I to say that, who am I in a sense, and especially here, I think we all get lumped together, and that's what we forget. I think we all forget that we are lumped together, whether you're Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, or even Sri Lanka, we're all lumped together, and we divide ourselves all the time. And that's why we've got no solidarity between us. And I like, well, I don't know, but there is this word desi, which to me means that we are from this Indian subcontinent and we're living here. And, if we look for the commonality beyond religion, beyond all sorts of things, you've actually got lots of commonalities between different classes. All the middle class, Pakistanis, Indians, Bangladeshis will have a lot more in common than maybe all the working class or the unemployed people from all those regions. So I think to just go to one identity, like Bangladeshi or Indian, it's not constructive. I think it is a much wider thing that we need to think about.
But class is part of identity as well.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. That is part.
No, I think we trying to do a lot of whatever you said about complexity. These things are fluid. I think I saw.
I just wanted to say that is there some sort of pressure out there that that's driving this identity issue? Is it a really big thing? Why is it that I feel uncomfortable to say something which I am? Why is there this uncomfortableness? Why can't we just accept, whatever we are saying? Why don't we do that? And what's the issue? What's the problem? What would, a personal question maybe to you guys, what would you like to be identified as?
Okay, so there's a question there to remember.
Give me a question.
I just wanted to make a small point regarding your train journey, and you didn't answer the question. Don't you think you missed out on an opportunity to get a discussion going?
No.
Do you think so?
No.
Might have lost a best friend that you never could have.
Possibly, there's no regrets there.
Why not? I would have regretted it.
It was about 2 minute conversation.
Yeah, it could have been an hour long. It would have made the journey a lot better.
I was trying to communicate broken Hindi, so.
More the reason. Improve your Hindi.
I was happy with the English surprise there.
Anyway, I shared a train journey with you.
I think that's a really good point. Choosing the level to be there. So I'm going to round up so the things before we get kicked out. So I'm going to thank the speakers, but also just give them a last chance to just reflect on any thoughts they might have.
There was a question about why do people want to know who you are? Because they want to control you, inform you, and make you, and sculpt you, and sell you crap you don't need.
I suppose, I don't know. I was talking about the idea of Asianness, and I don't know if we're all lumped together anymore. There's a lot of, people say that we are not with them, and there's a lot of kind of tensions within what could have once been called the Asian community. And I'm not sure if it would be possible to resurrect that. And also, I think, as someone who is a student of culture, I would say that there is a specific cultural tradition that is Bengali, that is, of Bengali literature, Bengali drama, art, and poetry that we need to celebrate, and that's very specific to it can be very locally specific. Different kinds of bita, different villages have different bita. So that's so I think we could be in the danger of homogenizing and simplifying identities by saying that we're all Asian or we're all there are distinctive elements, there are traditions that have histories of their own and roots, and I don't know, sometimes that gets flattened. I mean, sometimes Asian as a category was very useful for a particular kind of anti-racist movement at a particular time. But if people aren't identifying as themselves in that way now, then I'm not sure how it would be returned. And, I wouldn't say Bangladeshi food is very similar to North Indian food. If you've ever eaten shidki, then it's not. It's very different. There is a lot of similarity between Punjabi food and North Indian food, but so I would say that in some ways Bangladeshi food is a lot more like Burmese food and Thai food. So there are lots of other kinds of regional identities.
That's news to me. Okay.
No, Thai food, shrimp paste is basically shidki. When I was at university in Homestead, I used to eat shrimp paste.
In Malaysia, shidki as well.
So delicious. What are you talking about?
to left. I don't know if you had a shot.
We don't have
Yeah, you guys don't have it. It's like, it's interesting. But can I say something about what you said about like losing our culture if we don't identify with it? I think there is a difference. Like for example, I work with this girl who she's English, and as part of her anthropology undergrad, she actually went through like she went through a lot of the poetry from Bengal, and I asked her what she was. I don't know. I just had one. I read one day, and I really liked it. And the thing about this is why I think what we should keep alive is our cultural heritage, like poetry, music, art, language, things like that. But you don't have to like. I totally disagree with the idea of like bombarding someone with our identity. Because, okay, fair enough. I'm a Bengali, but that doesn't mean I know that I was in Tagore or not in Islam. I don't. But they are they're the ones who've made the Bengali culture rich and beautiful. Not what I happen to be born as, you know. So there is this difference, and I don't know if you've heard of the term BBCD, British Born Confused Desi. I really like that term because I related to that when I was a teenager, but that was me, you know. But the Bengali culture, the music, you know, that's my heritage, and I'm proud of it. Just like I'm also, as a Muslim, when I read about certain individuals, like Ibn Battuta or like Ibn Rumi, you know, okay, fair enough, culturally I'm not related to them, but when I read about things, what they've done, I feel proud of it because I can identify them to a certain extent. So, yeah, like, I don't know, I think, yeah, identity is a tricky subject. But I thought you liked being lumped together with Southeast Asia, and that's the main thing.
Okay, we need you to get inside.
We can be
round up now, just so
you can